This video kicks off the optimization section of the course. Now, what is this section? Well, this is kind of a living section, meaning that I'm going to be adding videos to this over time because this is the chance to go back and revisit the projects that we've done. I can, fix some mistakes because nobody's perfect. I make mistakes, or maybe I made an oversight, or maybe through the conversation in the comments or in the Slack channel, I realized there's a better way to build something or architect something, right? Because after, 1,000 or two students take this, there's a lot of discussion. And I realized that, there's some things I probably could have done better. So that's what this optimization section is for. It's a chance to go back and fix and optimize things. And I've done this in a previous course, and this turned out to be a lot of people's favorite section, because as you'll see through some of these videos is we start to have nuanced conversations about, how you style something, how you structure something, how you architect or build something, right? So this is more nuanced than like a straight up tutorial. And like I mentioned, a lot of this usually comes from discussions with students when they ask questions. So back to what I said about this being a living section, this is still during the pre-sale. The course isn't even fully done yet. Over the next 3 to 6 months, a bunch more students are going to take this course. More questions are going to pop up. So over that time period, if you are one of those early adopters taking this course right as it releases, I would check back in a couple weeks, couple months, because again, I expect this section to, have a few more videos in it. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's jump into a project and start optimizing, right? The whole reason why we're here. So open up your Apple Frameworks project, and we're going to do two things here. The first thing we're going to do, if you see on the framework detail view, is we're going to add a view model, right? We don't have a view model for this yet. And this is going to bring up, again, an interesting nuanced discussion about should we even add a view model here? It'll also give us a chance to use @ObservedObject, because before we've been using @StateObject for all of our view models. Well, as you can see, we're relying on a framework. So, we're going to pass that in. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The second thing we're going to do is, if you remember this Safari view that we created using the UI view controller representable to show the Safari view controller, well, again, somebody mentioned in the comments, and this I completely missed this, is that iOS 14 introduced a link object in SwiftUI that kind of renders this obsolete. Now, it's not 100% the same, so there could be value in knowing both, but we're gonna talk about that at that point. So anyway, those are the two major things we're gonna handle. Let's get to the view model first. Okay, so scrolling up here, I'm going to copy all of this, and we're gonna put it in the view model. And I did copy instead of cut because I don't want Xcode to yell at me quite yet. I'm not ready for that, it's too early in the morning. Command N for a new file, Swift file. And then we're going to do framework detail view model. Now, this initial part should be, a lot of review because we've done a lot of view models by now. Import SwiftUI, final class framework detail view model. And of course, what does it got to conform to? Observable object. Okay, now I'm going to paste in the three things I brought over. And we're going to adjust this a little bit. So this can be a let, right? We're not tweaking or changing the framework. We're just kind of like reading the data. And instead of @state private var, again, this is review. We've done this a ton, right? This needs to be published because again, on our view model, we want to broadcast whenever that changes. And actually, as I'm typing this is actually the thing we're not going to need anymore. I'm going to keep it here so you can flip back and forth between doing it the Safari view controller way and doing it the new, switching to Safari separately. We're going to dive into that when we do the link thing, but I'm going to leave that here for now. So the main change we got to make is with this binding. So when you pass a binding to a view model, you have to initialize it. So as you can see, it says class framework detail view model has no initializers. That's because we didn't give this a value. We didn't give our framework a value either. So we're going to have to create an initializer that gives these two things a value. However, we got to do something different with binding when we create an initializer on our view model. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's create our initializer. And this is just the typical class initializer. So init, and then we want to pass in a framework, which is of type framework. And then we want to pass in is showing detail view. And that is a binding bool. So it's a binding bool. Now, I'm going to try something, right? So I want to do self.framework equals framework. Again, typical initializer stuff. Self.is showing detail view equals is showing detail view. Now, it's going to get an error. Should, right? Yeah. Cannot assign value of type binding bool to type bool. So right now, is showing details is a bool. Well, @binding is just a property wrapper. So we can actually write this out the long way, var, and make it of type binding bool, just like we passed into our parameter down there. And then now we should be good to go. So essentially binding is kind of a shorthand way to write this, but also when you declare it like this, you have to use the wrapped value. You're going to see that in a little bit. but when you use @binding, it kind of does all that for you. So this is kind of like the long way to do it, but we have to do it here when passing this into the initializer. So now our view model is set up. Let's go back to our detail view, and real quick, I like my view model on top. Okay, so now I'm going to delete all these because we have them in our view model, but actually, hold on. We have to do @ObservedObject. Remember, this is where we used to do @StateObject to create our view model. Var view model, and then we don't set it equal to something. Remember, with StateObject, we were setting it equal to the initialization of our view model. Well, we're going to be passing it in with the ObservedObject. So our view model is of type framework detail view model, right? We're not initializing it with a value because we're going to be passing it in. So because we didn't initialize it with a value, anytime we create a framework detail view, we have to have an initializer on that now that creates a view model at that point and passes it in. So I'm going to do a Command B real quick so Xcode can tell me all my mistakes in life. Okay, all the way down here. So here we just want to do the typical view model dot, right? Because we moved everything to the view model. So Command C for the view model dot, Command V. And then up here, yep, Command V. And here's where you're going to start to see some of the wrapped value come into play. Yep, so this is showing detail view. If we go back to the view model, right, this is where we declared it not as an @binding, because again, that would take care of all that for you. We literally went the long way and say it's a type binding bool. So here's where you have to use .wrapped value. And you can see the underlying value referenced by the binding variable, right? So again, this is just kind of the long way to do it. Okay, one more Command B. We should be fine on this screen, or not. Okay, yes. Previews. I was going to say we should be fine on this screen. The issue is going to be when we initialize a framework detail view, because we no longer initialize it with a framework, is showing detail, yada, yada, yada. We initialize it with a view model. So let's get some practice with our preview here and initialize our framework detail view, get the autocomplete. You can see it takes in a view model. We can do framework detail view model, and then we initialize that with a framework. And do we have sample framework on here? I can't remember. Mock data.sample framework. Yeah. It's been a while since we touched this project, right? Okay, and then now hit return here for the is showing detail. Again, in our preview, remember we can do .constant, false, just to give it a value. Okay, that sets up our preview, but that was a preview, sorry, I know that was bad, of what we're going to be doing when we initialize our framework detail view. And if you remember, when do we initialize our framework detail view? Well, that is in our framework grid view when we actually tap on one of the frameworks. And you can see Xcode's yelling at us for where we're messing this up here. So we're going to do almost exactly what we just did here. So when we initialize this framework detail view, we need a view model, right? This is us creating the view model on the previous screen and injecting it into our framework detail view. And again, back to our framework detail view. In that scenario where we're injecting our view model, that's when you use ObservedObject. Again, before we were doing, equals, and then we were initializing our view model. That is when you use StateObject, when you're creating a new one on that view. Okay, I think I've said that a bunch before, but again, remember, my main goal for this course is for you to understand this passing of the data. Okay, so because we are injecting in, we're using ObservedObject. Let's go back and create our view model here. So framework, and again, the reason why we're injecting it is because we're relying on data from the previous screen, which is what we're on, right? We're relying on this view model dot selected framework. And let's hit return here to line these up. And then is showing detail view, right? We're relying on this binding. Well, it's on the view model. View model dot is showing detail view. Okay, my font is like really, really big. I'll make this small so it's not super ridiculous. Oh, remember, because it's a binding, we need the $sign. Forgot about that. A little smaller. Okay. Command B to make sure nothing is broken. Okay, so we should be all set up with our view model on our framework detail view. Let me run through that one more time. So now when we tap on our framework, right, we're going to initialize a framework detail view. However, we're creating a view model here because we're relying on the framework that we tapped in. We're relying on the is showing detail view that's up in our view model, right? We're relying on data from a previous screen. So we use that data from the previous screen, create our view model here, inject it into our framework detail view. So let's go to our framework detail view. And because we're injecting it, we're using @ObservedObject, and we're not initializing a new one. We're just making it of type framework view model. And then now, our view model has that data, right? We passed the framework, we passed the is showing detail view. Again, this is showing Safari view is kind of irrelevant at the moment. We'll come back to that. But we should be all set up. And then we just switched everything to view model, view model, view model. So let's make sure this works. And then we'll talk about like the nuance of, why you should do this or why you shouldn't do this. Okay, here we are again, Command-Shift-A to switch to dark mode. I just don't like this app in light mode. Click on ARKit. Cool, there's our ARKit stuff. I hit learn more. Okay, the behavior is exactly the same, which is expected because all we did was refactor and everything is working. So now let's talk about like, should you even do that, right? Because you could argue, if I go to my framework detail view here, right, you could argue it's just a framework, is showing detail, and then if we continue to use the link, like we don't even need this one. So really it's only two properties on this. So I guess the debate, if you will, the nuance, should you even do this, right? Because there's a valid argument for, Sean, it was much simpler to just have those two properties here. Like, why are you creating a view model for two properties? You're almost adding unnecessary complexity to make it more confusing than it was. That's argument A, right? So again, it's nuanced. The other side of that argument is, you should be consistent with your coding, right? If all your views have view models, any new people coming into your code base, they're going to expect that, right? If some of your views have view models, some don't, that could be confusing, right? So you can see why this type of stuff is very nuanced and highly debated, right? This is why there's all kinds of architecture and structure, debates in programming. You can see both sides of it, right? So I wouldn't argue with you if you thought adding the view model for this added unnecessary complexity. I wouldn't argue that. That's kind of how I feel. But at the same time, if you want to preach consistency in your code base, because that makes things understandable, I agree with that as well. So you see the dilemma here. And welcome to the wonderful world of online programming debates. This is why I stay away from this kind of stuff on Twitter, because it's meaningless. What you should do here, right? For your project, your team, whatever that is, you all should come up with an agreement on the style that you all find is best for your project, right? There's no blanket correct answer. Do what's best for you and your team. Okay, let's talk about link now, not Zelda, like a link. So basically we want to replace this button. If I run this again real quick, let me tell you what we're going to do with some visuals here. So tap Health Kit. This button right now, as you can see, is a button with a label, and this button, when it's tapped, we're flipping, is showing Safari view equal to true. That presents this sheet that you see here. We've done all that before. Well, again, new in iOS 14, which went over my head. I completely missed it. This is kind of the problem with SwiftUI being so new and so much getting added. It's very hard to keep up with everything. Even for someone like me, who it's kind of my job, with Swift news, creating content, it's kind of my job to keep up, and still stuff slips through the cracks. So if you're not up to date on everything, like don't worry about it. It's tough. Anyway, we're going to basically make this a link that pops open the Safari app. It doesn't keep you in the Safari view controller. It pulls up Safari app, but it is built into SwiftUI. So we don't need to have here in our UI kit components, right? This whole Safari view with make, view controller, all that stuff. Whoops, did not mean to do that. This could all be irrelevant, right? All you would have to do in the framework detail view, I'm going to write this above our button because we're going to use it. You type in link, initialize it. You see we want a destination and a label. As with all the SwiftUI stuff, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. The reason we want a label is because that allows us to kind of create our own view. If you just did the localized string and a destination URL, you're going to get the typical plain blue text link. No, we want our red button. We like the way that looks. So destination and label. And the destination, I'm going to literally copy and paste it from here, right? It's the same URL, right? So what this means is if we have a URL, like it doesn't return nil, we're going to use it. If it does return nil, we're going to send them to apple.com as like a default. So paste that there because that's the same. And then hit return here in the view builder for the label. And now this is similar to a button, right? If you think about how the button's structured, the first part of the button is what we want it to do. The second closure in the button is how it looks. Similar thing, right? We want this to go to this URL. How it looks is in the view builder. And we're literally going to do the same thing. Copy, paste the AF button into the link. And I'm just going to comment this out because I want to keep it in here so you have like a reference for both methods. Because again, there's a slightly little difference that you may need. Okay, so right now we just have our link. We don't have our button. We can actually even comment out this sheet stuff because we're not even using the sheet, right? We're going to pop open Safari, the app. So let's look at that. Run it. Click on Metal. See, our Learn More button looks the same, right? If we didn't do that initializer, it would have just been a blue typical link button. But now we got our styling that we want. Tap Learn More. Okay, see how it popped us over to Safari. It didn't just slide up the Safari view controller. We're now outside of our app in Safari, right? We can navigate wherever we want. You see, we do get the back button to our Apple Frameworks app, but you see we're completely switching apps. Now, here's the debate. Again, nuanced conversation, right? I've seen debate on Twitter where people think it's a better user experience to completely pop somebody out to Safari, right? It's completely separate versus just showing a Safari view controller. Because the Safari view controller is kind of like a limited version of Safari and you're still contained within your app. I guess that would be the benefit to it, is the user never leaves your app. Whereas, here they're leaving your app and going into Safari. So again, nuanced debate, right? But I did want to show you this. If you use Link like we did here, it's built into SwiftUI. You don't need our Safari view, UI view controller representable. You don't need all that. You don't need to present a sheet. And then this is what I was talking about. Because we're not presenting a sheet on our view model, like we would no longer even need this is showing Safari, right? That's irrelevant now because we're using our link to open up the actual app Safari. Okay, so those are the two things we handled, right? We added our view model. We discussed, should you even add a view model, that nuance. We talked about ObservedObject because we hadn't used that yet. And then we converted to Link, which again was new in iOS 14, away from our button and popping up our Safari view controller. So that does it for the first optimization video. Hopefully that gives you a little taste of like the type of stuff we talk about and we fix in these videos. On to the next one.